So yesterday we got through the beginning of January and we see Holling and this conflict that continues with Doug Switek's brother, and then we got to see him sort of work through that and this conflict with Dad and this conflict with his sister. And we got to see his sister in a whole different light. By the way, who are the two characters whose names we don't know yet? We got to see Mrs. Baker spell out Shakespeare for Holling. And then we got to see a new conflict because Holling, again, is much of a good person that he is. He's still fairly selfish. I mean, I don't know that we can put him at level 6 because he has so many moments where he's not. He's so selfish sometimes, the way that he thinks. And he said to Mrs. Baker, you know, you don't have anything to worry about when her husband is literally fighting in a war, and a bad war. And you can see 200 as Holling's sister kind of narrates for us what's going on in Vietnam. 200 soldiers dying almost every single day. All right, let's get started. Middle of January, and let's find out what happens with Mrs. Baker and Holling and see if this Doug Switek's brother stuff continues. Lying in bed that night, I listened as the drizzle turned to rain. And then the rain started to spatter quickly in the window. And then all sounds of it faded away, and my room began to grow cold. I got up and looked out, but the glass was covered with a sheet of thin ice, and the only thing I could see was the crazed pattern of the streetlight outside. In the morning, ice covered the town. If the sun had been shining, it would have been a spectacle like something Prospero might conjure up. But as it was, the tattered gray clouds hung even lower, and the mist was leaking out of them again, and the town looked more like the kind of foul heath where Macbeth's 3 weird sisters lived.
When the battle's lost and won,
that will be ere the set of sun. Where the place?
Upon the heath,
there to meet with Macbeth.
Again, you can see as he keeps reading these Shakespeare stories, he keeps connecting those stories with what's happening. And you can see that Gary D. Schmidt, the author, is kind of doing that as the author. He's doing this very well. You can see how the Wednesday Wars is sort of a modern tale of all of these Shakespeare plays put together. Gary D. Schmidt obviously loves Shakespeare. He's an English professor, and he's obviously taking something that he's passionate about and poured it into this story. And you can see that Holling is comparing like his situation with that. I do want you to picture this town right now, this rainy, drizzly town that now covered in a sheet of ice, but also that weather is a wonderful symbol that a writer uses to kind of set the tone, set the mood. As I walked to school that morning, the mist laid down a fine light coating of water on last night's ice, and by the time I got to the library, I could stand on the sidewalk, give a little push, and slide. By the time I got to Goldman's Best Bakery, I didn't even need to push. The last block and a half was all downhill, so I pointed my feet, leaned down a bit, bent my knees, and let myself go. Since there wasn't a single car anywhere, I didn't even stop at the corners. By the time I reached Camillo Junior High, I had enough speed to take out Doug Switek's brother, if he'd been anywhere in sight. Foreshadowing. Did Mr. Pete give something away? Maybe not. I could be making it up. And then suddenly there he was. Just like the 3 weird sisters appearing because Macbeth had thought of them. Doug Switek's brother on the other side of Camillo Junior High, waiting for a school bus to turn the corner so that he could grab onto its bumper and have it pull him along on the icy roads. Foreshadowing. It was what 8th graders whose career goal was the state penitentiary did. The school buses were driving around town, even though no cars were, because Mr. Gureshi was principal of Camillo Junior High, and Mr. Gureshi wouldn't have let the school close right before the New York State Standardized Achievement Test, even if the Soviet Union had started raining atomic bombs on the entire east coast of the United States. I heard that from Mr. Petrelli himself, and it's probably true. It's probably not. So the buses were driving on ice, and they all pulled in late. And you only had to look at the drivers' faces to see they were all mad at Mr. Gureshi. And Mrs. Baker was mad because we straggled in throughout the morning because the buses were late. I figured that the only one who was happy in the whole school was Mr. Ledema, Doug Switek's brother's teacher, because Doug Switek's brother stayed out until the last bus came in. It's the dictator of a small country thing, Danny said when he finally got to class. He was on the last bus. Mr. Goreshi thinks he can control the weather. He tells us to come to school in the ice, and we come. He tells bus drivers to drive in the ice, and they drive. He controls all the school buses of the world. He held his hands up high in the air. He controls us all! Danny Hupfer can get carried away. Irony. I'm not telling you why, though. You should type below. Why is that irony that Danny Hupfer is the one who Holling says gets carried away? But even if Mr. Goreshi could control the school buses like the dictator of a small country, he couldn't control the Long Island Power Company, which that morning was spending its time not giving electricity to most of its customers, including Camillo Junior High. You couldn't have raised a spark of electricity anywhere. Any light that came into the classrooms was from the windows, and on a day of gray, tattered clouds, that wasn't much. So we sat in the half-dark, in our coats, in the cold. We could hear Sycorax and Caliban scurrying in the walls, climbing down from the ceiling to find someplace warm to burrow in, like a human body. I figured they probably could sense us, and soon the walls would start to shred, and we'd see claws and nails, and there would be the clacking of yellow teeth, and before Burnham Wood could come to Dunsinane, we'd all run screaming out of the room into the misty cold. Keeps using that Shakespeare instead of Treasure Island. That's how we spent our day, preparing for the New York State Standardized Achievement Tests. In Mrs. Baker's class, we drilled on sentence diagramming, of course. In Mr. Samowitz's class, we drilled on mathematical sets. We didn't tell his homeroom class, who were coming into our room for sentence diagramming, about Sycorax and Caliban. We figured we'd hear if anything happened. Like they were going to really come out of the walls. In Mr. Petrelli's class, we recited European borders and exports, and as we drilled, our hands got colder and colder, so that by noon it was hard to feel our pencils with our fingers. But at lunch, Mrs. Biggio came into the classroom carrying a tray of thick paper cups, steaming with the hot scent of chocolate. Probably because she felt guilty about the something surprise from before the holidays. "Don't ask how I got them hot," she said to Mrs. Baker, "but if Mr. Goreshi is looking for his desk, he might have a hard time finding it." Can you believe it? Hot chocolate. All right, so think about, how Mrs. Biggio is feeling and how she felt before. And, she's obviously feeling a little better. And maybe she is feeling a little guilty. I also want you to take note, I'm wearing my Carolina Hurricanes hockey jersey, especially for this occasion. If Holling is going to get to ice skate, I should get to ice skate as well. Mrs. Baker laughed, a real laugh, not a teacher laugh, and sat down behind her desk with the cup Mrs. Biggio gave her. She held both her hands around it to warm them. Mrs. Biggio walked down the aisles, and we each took a cup from her. Doug Switek tried to take two, but when Mrs. Biggio put her heavy and sensible shoe on his sneaker, he put the extra cup back. My tea did not reach for the chocolate when Mrs. Biggio came beside her. She did not raise her head. And Mrs. Biggio did not pause. She finished the rest of the aisles and left with one cup still steaming on her tray. Important thing to note. She did bring a cup for my tea. My tea didn't take it, so she didn't stop. And Mrs. Baker, just a page or two before, talked about stubbornness and how people can be stubborn. And I want you to think about how that might play a part in this. About how sometimes when you do something wrong, it's so hard to make it right, not because the people aren't willing to, but because they're stubborn or they're afraid of the reaction. Mrs. Biggio might be afraid of how my tea might treat her after she treated my tea so bad in what she said. And my tea, obviously, might be afraid as well. "Let's begin the next sentences," said Mrs. Baker. We groaned. "Now," said Mrs. Baker, "while the sugar is coursing through your veins." She walked up and down the aisles to watch us work. I don't know if anyone else saw her put her cup of hot chocolate on my T's desk. What level is that? Not that she had suddenly become filled with the milk of human kindness. That's from the tragedy of Macbeth, by the way. Mrs. Baker did not even let us outside after lunch. We kept drilling. Is that why? Is it because she had to drill like with them for the tests, or was it because it's freezing out and icy and she doesn't want them to get hurt? In mid-afternoon, the clouds pulled up their tatters and started to thicken. Personification. Then they began to billow out toward the ground, as though they were carrying some heavy load and were about to split. They billowed further and further until a few minutes before we finished school, they finally did split. And huge, wet snowflakes fell from them onto the icy roads, just as the bus drivers were pulling into the parking lot, probably watching for signs of Doug Switek's brother. Foreshadowing. Before we left, Mrs. Baker read a memo that Mr. Goreshi had sent around to all the classrooms. Since the New York State Standardized Achievement Tests are to be administered tomorrow throughout the entire state, plan on attending school. No student will be excused without permission from the principal. Weather will not be a factor. The school will be open for the administration of the tests. Mrs. Baker put the memo on the desk. She looked outside at the snow that was already gathering on top of the ice. I will see you all tomorrow, she said. It was like Mr. Petrelli had said, even if atomic bombs had started raining down. When I left, I realized that for the whole day, Mrs. Baker had not said a word to me. So dumb. Through the late afternoon and evening, the wind sculpted the snow, first into low mounds, and then into strange, sharp shapes. 3 S's right in a row. It's a wonderful tool that authors use when they put those initial consonants in a row like that, called alliteration. And I know we've talked about it a little bit. Mr. Schmidt here uses it a ton in this book, and he uses repetition in a lot of different ways as well. So alliteration is one of those ways where you're saying things like strange sharp shapes, and you're using terms like really over and over again. That's not alliteration, that's more repetition to make something stand out. And when the wind was finished with the snow, it threw itself against our house, wailed under the eaves, and looked for any chink it could push through. At times, the Long Island Power Company would muster up some electricity and send it out, and suddenly all the lights in the house would flick on, along with my sister's radio turned up to full volume. And the light over the stoop would show how deep the snow had become, but then the electricity would flit away again, and we were left in the candlelight and cold. If you think the 4 of us huddled together under blankets like the pioneers and told stories and sang old Western songs in front of a roaring fire, you're wrong. And not just because houses on Long Island don't have fireplaces, at least none that give off heat. It was more like this. Every half hour when the shows switched, my mother walked over to the television and tried the on-off button several times. Then she turned the channel and tried the on-off button again. You'd think that at least this would work, she said. Then she turned the channel and tried again. When nothing happened, she went out to the kitchen and opened the window so we couldn't tell that she was smoking. We tried to ignore the cold billows that swept through the house and made us clutch the blankets around us even tighter. My father raged by the phone. He couldn't believe that employees of Hood and Associates were already calling, wondering if the firm was going to be closed the next day. Don't they know we have a contract to compete for? And they're going to let a little snow get in the way? They must not want to work for me much longer, he said. It's not like I'm the Mets and can play Ed Kranepool $24,000 next season. $24,000 for Ed Kranepool. Next thing you know, they'll be paying Tom Seaver $24,000 too. Are they out of their minds? Ed Kranepool, New York Mets. Tom Seaver started off with the New York Mets. Tom Seaver eventually became a Hall of Famer. $24,000. That's amazing, especially when you consider some of the players like Carlos Santana for the Cleveland Indians makes $20+ million a year. My sister was tormented, absolutely positively tormented by 3 things. First, she could never hope to put on her makeup without lights, and she'd die before she went out anywhere without her makeup. Hyperbole. Second, and these are supposed to be getting worse as we go along, the Beatles television special, which was at 8 o'clock, was starting right now, and was being seen by every single person in the country except for her. And somehow Ringo would find out about that and never, ever forgive her. And third, because the New York State Standardized Achievement Test would take an hour longer at the high school, she would be walking home at the same time as her brother, the one who wore yellow tights, who, if he knew what was good for him, would walk home on the far side of the road, far enough away from her that no one would ever suspect any sort of family connection. So it wasn't Pioneer Songs by the firelight. It snowed all night, and in the morning we looked like Alaska, northern Alaska. Hauling. Oh, Mr. Exaggerator Hauling. But it didn't matter. The whole new ice age could have started, and it wouldn't have mattered, because Mr. Goreshi was as good as his word. My sister's transistor radio announced that all the schools would be open, this despite more snow overnight than we had seen the last 3 winters combined. Students were advised to leave early, as travel might be slowed by the snow. Like this was the most astonishing observation of the century. So I did leave early, and I hiked through knee drifts to school, the wind still wailing and throwing itself against me, personification. 3 sharpened number 2 pencils for the New York State Standardized Achievement Test in my pocket since the power was still off at school. I wore thermal underwear top and bottom, plus an extra t-shirt, a sweatshirt, and 2 pairs of heavy socks. I was sweating by the time I reached Camillo Junior High, but I figured that I would be warm and cozy through the tests, even if I couldn't move my toes in my boots. That works as long as the power's off. None of the roads had been plowed yet, but enough buses had come down Lee Avenue that it was packed, hard, and slick. And Doug Switek's brother was riding the bumpers again, heading for the state penitentiary, all happy as if he had spent the last week with newspaper pictures and a jar of yellow oil paint, ruining my life. When I saw him riding by, holding on with just one hand, something in me snapped. I'm not sure what it was. I guess Presbyterians would call it sin, but I don't think it was sin. It was more like the human need for revenge. Sort of what Malcolm and Donalbain were thinking. Please note that I do know the names of the king's 2 sons. By the time I saw Doug Switek's brother come by again, my plan was fully formed. A snowball had appeared before me, a fatal vision. I dug down into the snow and pulled up some of the slush underneath. I packed the snowball tight. I rounded it so that it would fly straight. Then I spit on it a few times to give it a frozen overcoating. The next bus started to come down Lee Avenue. Uh-oh. Is he going to do it? In my mind, I could see it all. I pull back my arm. I plant my left foot. Doug Switek's brother comes sliding into sight. I release the fastball. His face turns towards me at the last moment, and the snow ice slush spitball splatters against his nose.
Where did you say you were from?
Perfect! I didn't really think it would happen that way. The snowball would hit the bus, or I'd miss entirely, or it would hit someplace that he'd hardly feel, or maybe he wouldn't even be holding the bumper, or maybe I wouldn't even throw it. But I did. And it all happened exactly as I had imagined it. Really. By the time he could get the snow and slush and ice spit out of his eyes and look for who'd thrown it, I was hanging up my coat in the coat room. Feeling like Jim Hawkins aboard the Hispaniola, putting her before the wind, and so paying back all the wicked pirates of Flint's crew. Vengeance is sweet. Vengeance taken when the vengee isn't sure who the venger is sweeter still. I went into the New York State Standardized Achievement Test happy. I stayed that way through the morning, filling in bubbles with my 3 sharpened number 2 pencils like you wouldn't believe, working through parts of speech like I was Robert Louis Stevenson, and making decimals look like playground stuff. Mr. Hutch would be happy with hauling. I had the Falkland Islands down pat, and when there was a long reading comprehension passage about the Mississippi River, I thanked the good Mr. Petrelli, who had made me get to know it personally. Then at lunch recess, during which we all sharpened our number 2 pencils again, the power came on. This brought as many cheers as Mickey Mantle. Right away, the radiators began to clank and pound as if Mr. Vandalario was going at them with a wrench, and the room started to grow warmer. Pretty soon, we couldn't see our breath anymore. Even Sycorax and Caliban scampered back up to their asbestos ceiling tiles. We took off our coats and hats and gloves and scarves and settled in for the second half of the achievement tests. Vocabulary first, mostly words that even William Shakespeare wouldn't have known. Halfway through the afternoon test, I took off my sweatshirt. The radiators were giving off that hot iron smell, sort of like a southwest wind that blisters all over you. Then spelling. The parts of the radiators that rust had worn down began to glow, softly. They took on a color that you can usually see only in sunsets. I kicked off my boots and one of the pairs of thick socks. Danny was already barefoot. It felt good to be able to move my toes again. Then a short section on Roman numerals. And on to fractions. The room was now downright tropical. And I had on thermal underwear. Thermal underwear that was supposed to keep me warm in minus 10-degree temperatures. I was starting to sweat everywhere, even my fingernails, and I think that I was probably turning the color of the rusted radiators. On to imperfect verb forms, which I had down, let me tell you. But I thought I was going to pass out. My fingers were sliding on my sharpened number 2 pencil, and I could hardly see the little bubbles anymore. I think my eyes were sweating. I raised my hand and asked Mrs. Baker if I could go to the boys' restroom. She picked up the instructions booklet for the New York State Standardized Achievement Tests. No student is permitted to leave his seat for any reason other than a dramatic health concern once a section of the achievement tests has begun. There are no exceptions. She set the instructions back on the desk and turned her face to the radiators, which by now were putting out so much heat that they were probably giving her a tan. Remember, they haven't spoken since he was an idiot. It seems to me that we were in a dramatic health concern territory, but you can't exactly raise your hand in class and announce that you have to go take off what I had to go take off. When we got to sentence diagramming, a section that Mrs. Baker began without even giving anyone a chance for a moment of release, most of the water component of my body had been sucked into the little cotton compartments of my thermal underwear. Everything felt squishy, and the answer sheet for my test had turned soggy, sort of like how cornflakes left overnight in half a bowl of milk look, with about the same smell. Definitely imagery. Definitely hyperbole. By 2:30, when we finally handed our answer sheets in, I was afraid that mine was going to dissolve into some sort of pulp. Marilee's answer sheet looked white and starched. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" she said. "Nope," said Danny. He was putting on his socks again. "Not bad at all," said Doug Switek. Even Doug Switek. How good a teacher is Mrs. Baker? Let's be honest here. Like, all these kids are acing this test. "Are you all right?" asked Marilee. "Anyone who needs to may now go to the restroom," said Mrs. Baker. I was the first one out of the room. I squished my soggy self down the hall as fast as I could, glad that there weren't any radiators there. I ran the last 20 yards or so, even though running in the halls is one of the deadly sins at Camillo Junior High. Right up there with pride, envy, wrath, I burst through the door into the boys' restroom, pulling at my top t-shirt, imagining the sensation of tearing off the thermal underwear. The boys' restroom was filled with 8th graders, all smoking. And Doug Switek's brother was leaning against one of the sinks. "That's him," said one of the 8th graders. He was pointing at me. "Him?" said Doug Switek's brother. He threw a cigarette to the floor and smashed it. I think he was trying to send me a message. He walked over to me, stuck his finger out, and poked it into my thermal underwear chest. "Did you throw that snowball at me?" "When?" I said. This is called a delaying tactic, and is sometimes more strategic than denial all by itself. "You!" he poked his finger into me. "Or!" he poked again. "Dead." He poked again. Then he waved his finger off on his shirt. This is getting familiar, isn't it? Another death threat. I could sort of understand how it must have been for Banquo, Shakespeare character. And for a moment, in my heated, sweaty brain, I could almost see him there in the boys' restroom, covered with stab wounds, looking sort of lost and shaking his head like he wanted to warn me. "Dead!" said Doug Switek's brother again. I backed out. Doug Switek's brother's little rat eyes followed me all the way. I went back to Mrs. Baker's classroom and sat down squishily. Toads, beetles, Bats! Are you feeling better? Asked Marilee. Just swell, I said. Real quickly, Banquo was friends with Macbeth until Macbeth starts to see him as a threat in the play. And he has Banquo killed, and Macbeth, feels guilty about that in the Shakespeare play and starts having these crazy visions of all kinds of things, and Banquo is one of those visions. Anyways, to the story. So now he hits him with the snowball, which was awesome, by the way, and then he gets caught and now is going to die. I think that as jokey as we are with Doug Switek's brother, Holling has been messing with him somewhat on purpose throughout this whole book. And I do want you to take that into account. Like, Doug Switek's brother is clearly kind of thuggish. We don't know Doug Switek at all. Okay for Now, the second book of this series. It's not really a series, but Okay for Now is a book that we talk about Doug Switek and Doug Switek's brother a little bit more. But Doug Switek's brother is clearly a troublemaker. I mean, I think we can understand that. But I also want you to note that Holling has egged him on quite a bit. So the conflict here is real. Holling is going to be leaving today, and something is gonna happen. All right. So today I want you to work on a crop QVS of your own. Tomorrow I'm going to show you a summary video, and we will do a summary of a shorter section sometime either at the end of this week or at the beginning of next week, okay? That's it for today. Tomorrow, on Thursday, we will find out a little bit more about what happens to Holling versus Doug Switek's brother, if anything. All right, on to tomorrow.